A little black girl tells her father something terrifying about her stepmother. He decides to hide in the closet, and the scene he heard left him in shock. Anaya loved the nights when the stars twinkled like tiny diamonds scattered across a velvet sky. The house was quiet, the hum of the air conditioner the only sound filling her small bedroom. She had her stuffed bunny, Mr. Flop, clutched under her arm as she sat by the window, gazing out at the peaceful street. Her window, slightly cracked open, let in the cool breeze that brushed her cheeks and rustled the leaves of the big oak tree in the front yard. It was past her bedtime, but she couldn't sleep. She was too excited because the weekend was approaching, and weekends meant trips to the park with her dad and Jasmine. Jasmine had been part of their lives for a while now. She wasn't her real mom, but she was fun, always bringing her favorite candies, baking cookies that filled the house with a warm, sugary scent, and reading her stories before bed. Tonight, though, something felt different. Anaya's eyes, tired but curious, noticed a shadow moving on the front lawn. She rubbed her eyes, thinking it might be a stray cat or one of the raccoons that sometimes tipped over their trash cans. But when she looked closer, she saw the figure of her stepmother, Jasmine. Anaya's heart skipped a beat. Jasmine was wearing a long coat, and her steps were careful, almost like she didn't want to make any noise. Anaya leaned forward, pressing her forehead against the cool glass. She watched as Jasmine glanced around, checking if anyone was watching. Her stepmother's face was tense, and her eyes darted back and forth as if she were afraid of being seen. Anaya felt her curiosity grow stronger. Why was Jasmine sneaking out so late at night? Jasmine walked down the driveway, her footsteps light and quick. She moved with a purpose, her hand clutching her coat tight around her. Anaya's eyes followed her as she crossed the street. She watched as Jasmine approached Mr. Parker's house, their next-door neighbor. Mr. Parker was a friendly man, always waving at them when he mowed his lawn or when Anaya and her dad played catch in the front yard. But he wasn't someone Anaya ever saw at night, and he certainly wasn't someone Jasmine ever visited after dark. Anaya's small fingers tightened around Mr. Flop's ear as she watched Jasmine knock softly on Mr. Parker's door. After a moment, the door opened, and Mr. Parker stepped out, smiling at Jasmine in a way that made Anaya's chest feel heavy. They talked for a moment, but their voices were too quiet for Anaya to hear. She could only see the way Jasmine leaned in closer to him, the way his hand brushed against her arm before they both disappeared inside. Anaya waited, her eyes glued to the house. Minutes passed, and then an hour. She tried to keep herself awake, but her eyelids grew heavy. The last thing she saw was the faint glow of a light turning off in one of the upstairs windows. When she finally drifted off to sleep, the image of Jasmine's shadowy figure was burned into her mind. The morning light streamed into Anaya's room, waking her with its warmth. She rubbed her eyes and yawned, trying to shake off the feeling of unease that clung to her from the night before. She could hear the sounds of breakfast being made downstairs, the clatter of pans and the soft murmur of her father's voice as he hummed to himself. Slipping out of bed, Anaya padded down the hall, her bunny still tucked under her arm. The smell of scrambled eggs and toast filled the air, and she felt a small smile tug at her lips. Her dad was at the stove, dressed in his usual blue robe, his hair a little messy from sleep. He turned when he heard her tiny footsteps. "Good morning, sleepyhead," he greeted, his voice warm and cheerful. "I was just about to call you down." "Morning, Daddy," she replied, her voice soft. Anaya climbed onto the stool at the kitchen counter, watching as her father plated the eggs and slid a piece of toast in front of her. But her mind wasn't on breakfast. It was on what she saw last night. She twirled a piece of toast between her fingers, hesitating. Should she tell him? Her daddy always told her to be honest, but what if it was nothing? What if she got Jasmine in trouble for no reason? Her father noticed her silence and tilted his head, a gentle smile on his face. "What's on your mind, pumpkin?" Anaya's eyes darted up to meet his. She felt her chest tighten. She loved her daddy more than anything, and she didn't want to keep secrets from him. "Daddy, why did Jasmine go to Mr. Parker's house last night?" Her father's smile faded, replaced by a look of confusion. He set down the pan and leaned against the counter, his brows furrowing. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" "I saw her from my window," Anaya explained, her voice small. "She went there really late, and she stayed for a long time." Marcus's face grew serious. He tried to keep his voice calm, but Anaya could hear the change. Anaya, are you sure you saw Jasmine? Maybe you were dreaming. Anaya shook her head firmly. I wasn't dreaming. I watched her go inside Mr. Parker's house. Marcus took a deep breath, rubbing the back of his neck. He glanced out the window, his eyes distant. Anaya felt a pang of worry. Had she done something wrong by telling him? Okay, sweetheart, he finally said, his voice softer. Thank you for telling me. Don't worry about it, okay? I'll take care of it. He kissed her forehead and gave her a reassuring smile, but Anaya could see the worry in his eyes. As he turned back to the stove, she felt a mix of emotions, relief that she had shared what she saw, but also a knot of fear tightening in her stomach. She didn't know what was going to happen next, but she sensed that her small world was about to change. In the days that followed, the tension in the house grew thicker. Anaya felt it, even though her father tried to keep things normal. He still made breakfast, still tucked her in at night, but she noticed the way he stared out the window more often, his eyes lost in thought. Jasmine, on the other hand, seemed to float through the house like a ghost. She still smiled at Anaya, still kissed her on the cheek, but her smiles didn't reach her eyes anymore, and her hugs felt less warm. One night, after Jasmine said she was going to visit a friend, Marcus sat at the kitchen table, his eyes dark and thoughtful. Anaya watched him from the living room, curled up with her stuffed bunny. She sensed that something was different, that her father was about to do something important. Daddy, she called softly, hugging Mr. Flop tighter. Marcus looked up, forcing a smile. Yes, Pumpkin? Is everything okay? He hesitated, then walked over to her, kneeling so they were eye level. Everything's fine, sweetheart. I just have to check on something tonight. He kissed her forehead and stood up. Why don't you watch your favorite show until I get back? In the days that followed, the tension in the house grew thicker. Anaya felt it, even though her father tried to keep things normal. He still made breakfast, still tucked her in at night, but she noticed the way he stared out the window more often, his eyes lost in thought. Jasmine, on the other hand, seemed to float through the house like a ghost. She still smiled at Anaya, still kissed her on the cheek, but her smiles didn't reach her eyes anymore, and her hugs felt less warm. One night, after Jasmine said she was going to visit a friend, Marcus sat at the kitchen table, his eyes dark and thoughtful. Anaya watched him from the living room, curled up with her stuffed bunny. She sensed that something was different, that her father was about to do something important. Daddy, she called softly, hugging Mr. Flop tighter. Marcus looked up, forcing a smile. Yes, Pumpkin? Is everything okay? He hesitated, then walked over to her, kneeling so they were eye level. Everything's fine, sweetheart. I just have to check on something tonight. He kissed her forehead and stood up. Why don't you watch your favorite show until I get back? Anaya nodded, but as she watched him leave the house, she couldn't shake the feeling that things were far from fine. She tried to distract herself with the bright colors and cheerful voices on the screen, but her eyes kept drifting to the window, waiting for her father's return. Meanwhile, Marcus parked his car a few houses down the street and waited. His heart pounded in his chest, the weight of doubt and suspicion pressing heavily on him. It wasn't that he wanted to believe his little girl was right, it was that he needed to know the truth. He had brushed off her concerns that morning, but his mind wouldn't rest. His hands gripped the steering wheel as he watched the darkened street. Minutes felt like hours until he finally saw Jasmine's figure emerge from their front door. She moved quickly, glancing around just like Anaya had described. Marcus's heart sank as he watched her cross the street and knock on Mr. Parker's door. The door opened, and there was Mr. Parker, smiling down at her. They spoke for a moment before Jasmine slipped inside, and the door closed behind them. Marcus sat in the car, the reality of the situation hitting him like a tidal wave. He felt a mix of anger and betrayal, emotions so intense they nearly overwhelmed him. He wanted to storm up to the door, confront them both right then and there, but he knew it wasn't the time. Not yet. Instead, he drove back home, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tight his knuckles turned white. When he entered the house, Anaya was asleep on the couch, her bunny clutched tightly in her arms. He gently picked her up and carried her to bed, tucking her in with a kiss on the forehead. As he watched her sleep, his heart ached. She was too young to be caught up in this, too innocent to understand the complexities of adult mistakes. But Marcus knew that the truth, no matter how painful, would have to come out. The following morning, the tension was palpable. Jasmine moved around the kitchen, making breakfast, her eyes avoiding Marcus's. Anaya felt the heaviness in the air but kept quiet, sensing that her presence was not enough to ease whatever was going on between the two adults she loved. Marcus watched Jasmine carefully, his eyes following her every movement. He could feel the anger boiling inside him, but he forced himself to stay calm. He needed to confront her when Anaya wasn't around, away from little ears that didn't need to hear the harsh reality of betrayal. When Jasmine left the kitchen for a moment, Marcus leaned over and whispered to Anaya, "Sweetie, can you play in your room for a bit? Daddy and Jasmine need to talk." Anaya hesitated, her eyes wide with concern. "Is everything okay?" He gave her a reassuring smile, even though it felt forced. "Everything's fine. It's just a grown-up conversation." She nodded slowly, clutching Mr. Flop as she walked up the stairs. Marcus watched her go before turning his attention back to Jasmine, who was returning to the kitchen, holding a cup of coffee. "Jasmine," he said, his voice firm but steady, "we need to talk." Jasmine paused, sensing the seriousness in his tone. She set down the coffee cup, her fingers trembling slightly. "What's wrong?" Marcus crossed his arms, leaning against the counter. "I know about last night." Her face paled, but she tried to compose herself. "What do you mean?" He sighed, feeling the weight of his words. "Anaya told me she saw you go to Mr. Parker's house. And I saw it myself. I followed you last night." Jasmine's eyes widened, and for a moment, she looked like she might deny it. But she saw the determination in Marcus's eyes, the way he didn't blink, the hurt he was trying to hide. She dropped her gaze, the facade she had been holding up crumbling. "Marcus, she began, her voice shaking. "It wasn't supposed to happen. I made a mistake." His expression remained hard. "A mistake? Is that what you call sneaking around behind my back with our neighbor?" Tears welled up in Jasmine's eyes. "It's not what you think. It's complicated. I was lonely, and I didn't know how to tell you. I'm sorry." Marcus felt his anger and hurt rise, mixing with the sorrow he had been holding back. "You should have talked to me, Jasmine. We could have worked through anything together. But this? You lied to me. And you dragged Anaya into it. She's just a kid." Jasmine wiped her tears, her hands trembling. I know. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I don't want to lose you." Marcus shook his head, the decision solidifying in his mind. "It's too late, Jasmine. I can't look past this, not after what you did. And I won't let Anaya grow up in a home where this kind of dishonesty exists." Jasmine's shoulders slumped, and she nodded slowly, realizing that no amount of apologies would change what had happened. "I'll pack my things," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Anaya, sitting at the top of the stairs with Mr. Flop in her arms, listened to the conversation, her heart heavy. She understood that things were changing, that Jasmine would no longer be part of their home. She felt a mix of emotions: guilt for telling her father, sadness for the loss of the woman she had grown to love, and confusion about the feelings swirling in her chest. Later that day, as Jasmine packed her belongings, she knelt down beside Anaya, who sat quietly on the edge of her bed. "Anaya, I'm so sorry," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I hope one day you can forgive me." Anaya didn't know what to say. She hugged Jasmine tightly, tears in her own eyes. She felt the warmth of Jasmine's arms around her, and for a moment, she wished she hadn't seen anything at all. Maybe then things would have stayed the same. But as Jasmine left, and it was just her and her dad in the house again, Anaya felt a strange sense of relief. It was just the two of them again, like it used to be. And even though her heart ached, she knew they would get through it, together. The days after Jasmine left were quiet. Too quiet. Anaya felt the emptiness in every corner of the house. Her father tried to keep things normal. He still made breakfast, still asked about her day at school, and still read her stories before bed. But the brightness in his eyes was gone, replaced by a shadow of sadness that lingered, no matter how much he tried to hide it. Anaya noticed the changes. Her dad wasn't smiling as much, and when he thought she wasn't looking, she would catch him staring off into space, his eyes filled with pain. She wished she could make him feel better, but she didn't know how. Every time she thought about Jasmine, she felt a tug in her chest. She missed the way Jasmine would braid her hair in the mornings, the way she would laugh when they baked cookies, and the warmth of her hugs. But every time she remembered what she saw that night, she felt guilty. Maybe if she had kept quiet, Jasmine would still be there, and everything would be like it was before. One night, as her father tucked her into bed, she finally asked the question that had been weighing on her heart. "Daddy, are you sad about Jasmine?" Marcus paused, sitting on the edge of her bed. He looked down at Anaya, his eyes soft but tired. "Yeah, sweetheart, I am. I miss her." "Is it because of what I told you?" she whispered, her voice small and full of doubt. Her father's face tightened for a moment, and he reached out to smooth her hair. "No, Pumpkin. It's not your fault. You did the right thing by telling me the truth. Sometimes adults make mistakes that have nothing to do with you. What happened between me and Jasmine was because of us, not because of you." Anaya nodded, but she still felt the ache in her heart. She wished his words could erase the sadness she felt, but deep down, she knew things were broken in a way that couldn't be fixed. Her father kissed her forehead, but when he walked out of her room, she heard him pause outside the door, taking a deep, shaky breath before he went to his own room. As the months passed, Anaya and Marcus tried to build a new routine. They went to the park on weekends, played board games at night, and even tried making some of the recipes Jasmine used to cook. But no matter how hard they tried, there was an unspoken heaviness that hung between them. Marcus threw himself into his work, trying to provide for Anaya and give her the best life possible. But every time he looked at her, he was reminded of the life they had before, and the family they lost. Anaya felt her father's sadness even when he smiled. She sensed the weight he carried and tried her best to be the perfect daughter, helping around the house, getting good grades, and always being cheerful when he came home from work. But she missed Jasmine, and she missed the way her family felt before everything changed. One cold evening, about a year after Jasmine had left, Marcus came home later than usual. Anaya was already in bed, her eyes drooping as she tried to stay awake, hoping he would come in to say good night. She heard the front door open, the soft click as her father locked it, and then the sound of his footsteps as he made his way upstairs. Anaya's eyes fluttered open when she heard him stop at her door. He didn't come in right away. Instead, he lingered outside, and she could hear him sigh. When he finally entered, she could see the exhaustion in his eyes, the way his shoulders slumped under the weight of everything he'd been carrying. "Hey, Pumpkin," he said, his voice gentle but tired. "How was your day?" "It was okay," she replied, her voice sleepy. "I missed you." "I missed you too." He forced a smile and sat down beside her, stroking her hair. "I'm sorry I'm late. Work has been a lot lately." Anaya nodded. She didn't fully understand the pressures of his job, but she could tell that it was weighing him down. "It's okay, Daddy." As he kissed her good night, she grabbed his hand, holding on tight. "Daddy, are we going to be okay?" Marcus's eyes softened, but there was a sadness in them that Anaya had seen too many times before. "Of course, sweetheart. We'll always be okay. It's you and me, right?" She smiled, nodding, but as she closed her eyes, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The following morning was like any other. Anaya got dressed for school, and Marcus rushed around the kitchen, making breakfast. But there was a new kind of distance in his eyes. He hugged Anaya a little tighter before dropping her off at school that day, his words lingering in her mind. "I love you so much, Anaya. Never forget that." Anaya went through her school day like normal, but when the final bell rang and her teacher told her she was being picked up by someone else, she felt a knot of worry in her stomach. It was Mrs. Jones, a family friend, who waited for her at the school gates. "Hi, Anaya," she said, her smile forced. "Your dad asked me to pick you up today." "Where's Daddy?" Anaya asked, her eyes searching for him. Mrs. Jones's face faltered, but she took Anaya's hand. He had something come up, honey. Let's get you home, okay?" The ride home was quiet, and Anaya felt the fear creeping up her spine. When they arrived at her house, it wasn't just Mrs. Jones there. There were 2 police officers standing by the front door. Anaya's heart raced, and she felt the tears prickling at the corners of her eyes. "Where's my dad?" she asked again, her voice trembling. Mrs. Jones knelt down beside her, holding her hands. "Anaya, sweetie. Your dad, he's not coming home." Anaya's eyes widened. "What do you mean? Where is he?" She saw the sadness in Mrs. Jones's eyes, and one of the officers stepped forward, speaking softly. "I'm sorry, Anaya. Your father. He had an accident at work. He's gone." The words felt like a punch in the stomach, and Anaya's legs gave out beneath her. She crumpled to the ground, her sobs filling the air. Everything she had known, was slipping away. She felt the world spinning, and the warmth of Mrs. Jones's arms wrapped around her did nothing to stop the pain. After her father's death, Anaya moved in with Mrs. Jones. The house felt foreign, and the rooms that were once filled with laughter and warmth now felt empty and cold. She missed her father's hugs, the sound of his voice, and even the smell of his cologne that lingered in the air. She missed the life they once had, even if it was only for a short while. She lay awake at night, staring at the ceiling, clutching Mr. Flop tightly. She thought about Jasmine, about the family they used to be, and the secret she wished she had never uncovered. Maybe if she hadn't said anything, things would have been different. Maybe they would still be a family. But the truth was, none of that mattered now. Anaya whispered into the darkness, her voice filled with sorrow. "I'm sorry, Daddy. I wish I could have kept us together." But in the quiet of the night, there was no answer. Just the empty silence that reminded her of everything she had lost.